things that came from America, corn, potatoes, you know, and even the fertilizer, guano. At least tomato. So a lot of the things that today we take for you know, granted in our diet, actually they came, they were discovered by Europeans when they conquered, when they colonized America. To the point that you have to wonder, what were they eating before they discovered all these things? Yeah. And one was the world's first intensive fertilizer, although this is a little later. But this thing meant that eventually the food supply available to Europeans more than doubled, and that's one of the reasons why you had a population explosion in Europe, actually. It was an indirect consequence of America, the discovery of America. So meanwhile, to me, that's another ripple effect. Byzantium falls, so the historical land of the Greeks falls to the Ottomans. A lot of Greek-speaking intellectuals leave Greece and move west. And that's one of the things that changed this picture. The Great Library of Cambridge University had only 122 manuscripts in 1422. Today it has millions. The demand for books increased after it's always hard to predict the future. Nobody would have thought that that was a consequence of losing Byzantium to the Muslims. But the demand for books in the West actually increased after, because a lot of literate people moved to the West. So there was probably one trigger that helped create demand for books. Of course, there were other reasons. Since the Golden Century, it had become important to be able to read and write and calculate just for trade purposes. The Italian city-states were the most literate in Europe because of trade. So there were other reasons why people would consume books, but that was one of them. Again, why did we have to wait until 1456? Because all the technology that Gutenberg used, which is it's the same technology that they used to make wine, was available to the Romans. Of course, it was available to the Chinese too. The Chinese didn't invent the movable type because they have 800 characters. They had invented a different kind of press. But Europeans had the technology, the paper, an alphabet of between 20 and 30 letters. There was no motivation to print books. Okay? There was just no public. But at this point, there is a public. And one reason is the Greek exodus from Byzantium. So the culture shock, when Gutenberg did this, the culture shock was that all copies were identical. You know, the monks who were copying manuscripts, they would make mistakes. To this day, we have scholars trying to figure out which is the best text of the Gospels, the best text of the Quran. I mean, of course there are mistakes. They were copied manually by people who made mistakes. When Gutenberg produced these 210 copies, they were all identical. That's a major revolution, actually, in the history of civilization. That's the beginning of mass production. You know, today we are used to the idea that those chairs are all identical. Back then, those chairs were not identical. They were handmade by somebody. Sometimes you used 3 nails, sometimes you used 4 nails for the same thing. They were almost impossible to have them identical. So before the press, they estimate 50,000 books in all Europe. By 1501, which is just not even 50 years, 1,000 printing shops in Europe, which had produced 35,000 titles and 20 million copies. Where's the evidence that the Greek exodus was important? A lot of the Greeks who fled went to Italy. Italy was not particularly rich at this point, but many of the first printing presses are in Italy. The demand for books was very high in Italy. And the printing press, influential to spread Luther's ideas around Europe. He used this new technology. The same way Obama used the web to get elected. You know, he was one of the first people to understand the power of this new technology. It also encouraged people to write in the vernacular. Now, before the printing press, the church, not as a political organization, but in general, the church pretty much controlled what gets published. And not only that has to qualify according to the dogmas of the church, but it has to be in Latin. Latin was the language. All the way to Newton, it would still be the official language of the literate people. But with the printing press, a lot more people can print, and a lot of people can read. And a lot of people probably at that point didn't really understand Latin well. So then the printing press indirectly helps French, Italian, German spread and become what they are today, which indirectly also creates a national identity. You know, the whole of Italy spoke Italian. They were fragmented in many states, same with Germany, but they all spoke German. So it was the language that created that unity. Not Latin, which was universal, which sounds good, but actually was a caste kind of thing. The other thing that happens at this point, which is interesting, that culture leaves the monastery. These are some of the greatest people. Many of them are in the following slides. And I just listed the profession of the father, and you have just everybody, from soldier, farmer, you know, some of them come from aristocrats, but a lot of them are pretty much ordinary people. And their ideas spread, and to this day, we remember them as very influential. Questions so far?
Was there an equivalent Renaissance ever within the Ottoman Empire?
So first of all, we're not at the Renaissance yet. We're getting there. See, the Ottomans didn't need a Renaissance. They were at the peak of their civilization. So, in fact, you could argue that their decline begins with the Renaissance, because as Europe ascends and the Ottomans start losing some of their power and economic power, and that always has an effect. So this is really before the Renaissance, but anyway, it depends on where you start counting. You know, most people start counting with Brunelleschi, art-wise, and most people start counting with the discovery of America, 1492. Anyway, so of course Leonardo is not only a genius per se, but he lived in the century where he could be what he was. I mean, his notes are incredible. This guy had interest in just about everything. Well, you know, 500 years earlier, he would have been busy surviving in a place with endemic warfare, famine, diseases, and so on. So something had changed in the spirit of the time. And he personally was directly influential in the field of mechanical engineering. Now, great books on mechanical engineering had existed already under the Greeks, but after Leonardo, they become, by the way, his manuscripts were lost until the 18th century, so it was mostly word of mouth. In his case, it was not the printing press, but just his reputation was so strong that within a century you see all of these books becoming very popular. And by the way, each of them are great works of art. If you see the illustrations, they're just amazing. And they all talk about machines. And if you think we live in the age of machines, actually that was probably the first age of machines, where these books were very popular, and they describe all sorts of mechanisms to do what? All sorts of simple things. They were not thinking of factories yet. But there's something there. You know, they're thinking in terms of machines that do things instead of thinking in terms of humans that do things. So Leonardo was very influential in starting that way of thinking, that you can control nature by building machines. As you probably know, very few of these machines were ever built. we're still in the age where technological progress is independent of scientific progress. Today we live in the age where we put them together. You know, biology discovers something, and then there's a startup in Silicon Valley that does something with it. Not back then. And this will still be true in Britain 2 centuries later. A lot of technological progress happens independent of the sciences. Of course, one reason that the sciences were still very primitive. The sciences could not explain most of what was going on. Copernicus, another big thing that happens at this point, Copernicus comes up with the heliocentric theory, displacing the version preferred by the church, that the sun, that the earth is at the center of the universe. And with Copernicus, Copernicus actually presented it very humbly as just an easier way to make calculations. But anybody who was not stupid realized what he meant, that the church was wrong, and everybody had been wrong for 1,000 years. It's interesting that the church actually didn't get too upset with this theory. Didn't particularly like it, but what really what really upset the Pope was something else. We'll get there. So a lot of things are a side effect of America. I keep asking people when we talk about the discovery of America, where's America in the Bible? So it was one of the things that triggered a new way of thinking. The Bible doesn't talk about America. There's no America in the Bible or in the Quran. So if the Bible, it doesn't mean you have to argue against the Bible. You can still be, a loyal Christian, whatever. But the discovery of America indirectly proves the Bible does not contain all the truth. You may have no problem believing in Adam, Eve, and everything else, but now we know the Bible does not contain all the truth. There might be truth that is not in the Bible. That was an important step, psychological step. So it was also possible to start thinking in ways different from the traditional way of thinking. Needless to say, the northern countries, the countries that had the Reformation, had more freedom for scientists. And so it's not surprising that you see people like Tycho Brahe and then Kepler studying the universe. So the big thing was that he discovered a nova. He discovered a new star. Today we know it's a nova. He saw a new star in the sky. That's shocking. They always thought the stars have always been there. God put them there. They're always the same. They will always be the same, forever and ever and ever. He found out that's not the case. That was another major psychological shock. The world above the moon is not as perfect as we think. And very quickly we realize it is as messy as down here. And Kepler found rules, mathematical equations, to explain why the planets move the way they move. I mean, they knew that every now and then you see Mars, Venus, and whatever, even without telescopes. But why? Well, he found the equations, and so he found out that the heavens are a machine. You can extrapolate and decide, maybe all of those stars obey mathematical formulas. That's a big change. That universe that was static for so many thousands of years suddenly becomes a very dynamic place. Those things up there move in the sky. Trivia. Let's see if you know this one. The same thing happened in all these places between those dates. Can you tell me what? To make you feel better, nobody ever guessed in 20 years of teaching this class. What happened is absolutely nothing. When the Gregorian calendar was introduced, most countries had to skip some days. So like Italy went from the 4th of October to the 15th of October. there never was a 5th of October 1582. And different countries introduced the Gregorian calendar at different times. Back to us. Bacon, Francis Bacon and Descartes, Galileo, now you will see one after the other. So at this point it's become obvious that what we knew, we didn't know. that all the things that were taken for granted throughout the Middle Ages, and before that by most of the Romans, were just not correct. You know, why? Because they were just based on intuition. Obviously the sun revolves around the earth. Well, that's what common sense tells you. Turns out it's not that way. Or because they were based on religious dogma. And so at this point it becomes obvious that we need to do things differently. So Bacon is probably the first one who says, well, if you want to know the truth, you have to use objective, unbiased, empirical observation. Just forget the Bible, forget common sense, just do your observation, do your experiments, and find the truth. So he's one of the founders of the scientific method. Galileo is one who did that, did just that. Bacon was more a philosopher, Galileo is a physicist, a mathematician, and so he does that. He does his own experiments, and he reaches some powerful conclusions that will be true. In fact, they will influence Einstein, even after Newton. Newton took most of these things and just unified them in a very elegant framework. So a body in free motion does not need any force to continue moving. That's always been a mystery. You know, why does the arrow keep moving? I mean, at the beginning, yes, there's a force, but then it keeps moving. What makes it move? You know? And Galileo said, well, actually, the other way around. You know, things just tend to move of a uniform linear motion unless you stop them. When a force is applied, what happens? It's not the speed, it's the acceleration. When you apply force, there's an acceleration. And of course, Newton will formalize this. F equal m times a. And acceleration is the same for all free-falling objects. We don't know if he really did it, but legend says he climbed the Leaning Tower of Pisa, dropped 2 balls of different materials. I don't know if he ran down. Somebody down there checked and they arrived at the same time. The same laws apply on Earth and in heavens. Matter has to behave the same way everywhere. And so on and so on. So, and that was the beginning of relativity. He was the first one to decide that there is no way of telling uniform motion from rest. That's why right now you're not like this. The Earth is traveling around the sun, very fast speed, but we don't feel it. There's no difference between rest and uniform motion. You cannot tell the difference unless you are out there looking down and then you see us traveling around the sun. So that's the beginning of relativity. Conservation of energy. He realized that energy can change in quality, but the total amount of energy is always the same. So a lot of powerful intuitions coming out almost of nowhere, because previous centuries didn't do a lot of this thinking. And then so you have progress in the very fast, the very small, the very far. The very fast because this gentleman discovers the speed of light is finite. This will have huge consequences later on. You know, so it means that light. If I say that I see you now, that's not true. It was actually a few milliseconds ago. It took some time to then somebody else uses a primordial microscope and sees microorganisms. There are animals that you cannot see. There are things you cannot see. And then there are also very far away things that you cannot see. Galileo used a telescope. That's actually what the Pope did not like. The heavens are the realm of God. It's not nice they use a telescope to peek into God's house. That was actually the thing that really created a problem with the church. Galileo documented the moons of Jupiter. So the telescope was, he probably did not invent the telescope, but he's the one who pointed it to the heavens. And the telescope revealed many more stars that the human eye cannot see. So both the microscope and the telescope also contribute to this revolution in thinking. There's a lot more out there than we can see. And then came Descartes, and Descartes, a religious man, another man who had a very huge influence on Western philosophy and science. So first of all, he founded science as we know it today. He's the one who took Bacon and Galileo formalized. Okay, to do science, you have to be extremely rational. You take the problem, you divide it in sub-problems, solve each problem, recombine the whole and the sum of the parts. Reductionism. That's been to this day, no matter what they tell you, that's the principle science uses everywhere. And that's how they build this building, that's how they build your car, your smartphone, and so on. Then he admitted that animals are mechanisms. So again, there's emphasis on machine here. He admitted that animals are machines. He even admitted that the whole universe is a machine. He even admitted that our body is a machine. Okay, that was powerful. How did he get away with the fact that he was religious? Well, somebody started this mechanism. So God is the one that set the clock in motion. And the body is a machine. Eventually somebody will explain how it works. Just like animals are machines. But we have a soul. And that's a big thing he did. He separated what today we call mind and body. And that was the beginning of one of the most powerful schools of philosophy, dualism. Okay? There's body and mind. Back then soul.
But the Greeks had that too. Right?
We'll get there. So he separated these two things, and in doing so, he pretty much separated religion and science. That was a masterpiece, a political masterpiece indirectly, because there was no reason to fight each other. You know, religion takes care of the soul and tells you what you have to do to go to paradise. Science will tell you everything about matter, including our body, but in general, you know, whatever. So he really found a compromise, very powerful compromise between science and religion. And since then, that's been the case, actually. We've been separating. Today, we call it psychology and not religion. But to this day, there's somebody studying atoms and molecules and so on. There's somebody else studying mind. So indirectly, it's still there. I'll get to your question in a few slides. And you probably heard the cogito ergo sum. You know, in philosophy, he started discussing who am I, you know, and that was also powerful because he started the philosophy, introspective philosophy on very rational basis. He was trying to explain what certainly exists out there, and he reached the conclusion: the only thing I'm sure of is that I exist. I think, therefore I am. Period. Everything else we can argue. That was the beginning of a very long conversation. I said this. Reduction, I said this. And, you know, he invented these things. So he was already saying you have to base everything on mathematics. You know. Okay, then we have Hobbes. And then we'll have Locke and Hume and Berkeley. So we see them rapidly. And then I will make the connection with the Greeks. So materialism. Hobbes goes to the extreme. He says, well, everything, nature is just a mechanism. Everything is just matter, and everything can be explained by the laws of matter. So that's the beginning of materialism, where you deny any power of the soul mind. Now, does he deny that the mind exists? No, he just denies that the mind has an impact on what happens. So today we call this materialism. It's a school of philosophy. Spinoza, all of these are Northern Europeans, by the way. All of these philosophers are Northern Europeans. There is only one substance, God. So it's different from Descartes, who said two substances, matter and mind. And Spinoza said, no, that's just an illusion. There's only one substance, and that substance is God. And everything that exists is just an emanation, a limited emanation of that one substance. And your goal is to become one with God, nature. And on purpose, I wrote it the way a Hindu would write it, because the similarity is striking. Salvation is living in harmony with nature. That's almost Taoist. That is actually Taoist. Knowledge and meditation, emphasis on knowledge and meditation. So totally different approach. We've had Descartes, one kind of philosophy. Then Hobbes, materialism. Then Spinoza, this is called pantheism. Okay, that interrupts my flow. So I thought there would be Locke, Hume, Berkeley. So the point is, this is beginning to feel like the class on Greek philosophy. Now you had all these Greek philosophers saying all sorts of things and arguing among themselves and ignoring the official religion. You know, all those Greek philosophers had their own idea of how the universe was created, how change happens, what logos does, what psyche does, and there was a wild variety of different ideas that coexist and nobody got killed. We haven't seen that through the Roman and Christian era until after the Reformation. So what happens after the Reformation? Not because Luther wanted it, but the religious power to control philosophy collapses in the northern countries. That's why I kept saying all in the northern countries, okay? The Reformation countries. The power of the church there to send people, to burn people at the stakes has greatly diminished. It's gone down to zero. And so guess what? Again, when you have a vacuum in religion, what you have is a proliferation of different philosophies. So to me, that's a similarity.
They're all somewhat muted, though. They're still like strongly influenced by that religious presence, it sounds like.
Say it again?
It sounds like a lot of these philosophies are still somewhat muted by that strong religious presence.
No, I think, actually, I think they're pretty, I mean, Spinoza obviously believed in, I mean, all of them were religious, I guess, except Hobbes. But their God was not the God that the church would have liked to hear. So I think there's a strong divergence there. And of course, back then, the way they were presented was not as radical as it sounds today. If you read the books, some of them start by paying tribute to God and so on. But the consequences were obvious even to their contemporaries. It was obvious that it was a speculation that did not depend on what the Bible says. So I think it was actually pretty revolutionary. And some of these people will not be influential for a while. It will take some time for their philosophy to be pervasive. There weren't that many philosophers in the first place back then. I think it's very similar to what happened in Greece, actually. It's another moment in time where you have a proliferation of different philosophical ideas. And guess what? It comes to the time where the centralized religion has lost power to control. Okay, this is chronological, so I interrupt the story about philosophy and get into science. So Newton picks up Galileo's ideas and turns them into equations. That's really the big thing that he did. And in turning things into equations, something happens, that you discover things that are implied in those ideas, but they were not clear. Like, indirectly, Galileo is assuming that there is space and time. Otherwise, you can't even open your mouth. And so Newton assumes there is an absolute space and time that is the same for everybody. You need a force there's a force somewhere that causes acceleration. That's what Galileo discovered. Yeah, but what's the connection? Mass. Newton has to introduce the concept of mass, which actually is not intuitive at all. Weight is intuitive. Mass is not. What is mass? They will discuss for 220 something years what is mass, until Einstein gave a different kind of answer. So by writing those equations, he came up with a lot of things. They were very interesting. Of course, the most important was the gravitation. Yeah, the equation of gravitation. Indirectly, when you write down the equations, actually directly, you see that according to those equations, every mass attracts every other mass. It's just that it declines with distance. But the sun attracts the Earth, and this way Newton explained Kepler, by the way. Those equations that Kepler just found out by observation, Newton derived them from the general equation of gravitation. But there's a powerful thing there. First of all, there's a force that we don't see, the gravitational force. And force is when I push this table. Okay? That's my hand pushing the table. But what's causing the gravitational force? Newton didn't have an answer, but there's got to be a force if there is an acceleration. So by being consistent, Newton indirectly did philosophy. He introduced some concepts that were very powerful. And of course, the great thing, the apple under the tree, well, the great thing, he unified terrestrial physics and extraterrestrial physics, okay? The same laws apply here and apply out there. That was magic, you know, it was very powerful. And Galileo had the intuition, but didn't have the equation. He had a very simple equation that explained everything. Force equals mass times acceleration. And then conservation of energy, some others. But these very simple equations, it's incredible, work here on this planet and work everywhere. They explain why the apple falls from the tree, and they explain why the Earth revolves around the sun. So this I already told you. The old view of the world, the universe is static. Stars have been placed by God in their place and will always occupy that location. This collapsed, you know, with Kepler, Galileo, and Newton. This view collapses. Suddenly the universe is messy, confusing, changes, and we don't really know what's out there. Because with more powerful telescopes, we keep seeing other things. So back to philosophy, Locke, Berkeley, and Leibniz, and Hume, all northern countries, different ideas, different philosophies. Okay? Locke is considered the founder of empiricism, that everything derives from experience. You have experience, and then you know what's out there. Berkeley is considered the founder of idealism, who said, I have no idea what's out there. The only thing that really exists, everything exists in my mind. The only thing that exists for certain is in my mind. And that's all there is. And Leibniz similarly thought only minds exist, except he saw different degrees of mind. Everything is mind, and there's different degrees, coming from matter, whose minds are very simple, and then ending at the top of their hierarchy with the mind of God, which is the greatest of all minds. And these minds are called monads, and created its own philosophy based on this idea. Leibniz was also one of the inventors of calculus with Newton. Newton needed calculus for his equations. Leibniz reached the idea of calculus just by speculation. And it's, I want to. And Hume was the skeptic instead. His philosophy was, we cannot be sure of anything. He said science is based on what today we call induction, on extrapolation. Okay, if I drop a coin, it will keep dropping and dropping and dropping and dropping. Therefore, I conclude that when you drop a coin, it falls to the floor. But he said there's no evidence that if you do it 1,000 times, the 1,000 times the coin doesn't start flying. Okay? You just extrapolate it. So it was the skeptic. He said, well, no matter how many times you repeat the experiment, you never know for sure. It could be just a coincidence. And he was a skeptic in everything. So also the self is an illusion, because mental life is just a series of flashes, thoughts, feelings, sensations. I am nothing but the bundle of perceptions, he said. So he was the skeptic of this crowd. But the point is, so you have Hobbes, you have Descartes. Everything starts with Descartes, who is the dualist. Mind and body. He separates the two. They obey different laws. Go figure out. Then you have Hobbes, who is the materialist. Everything is matter. They're just laws of matter, material laws that explain everything. They explain what we do. Then you have Spinoza, who thinks everything is God. Then you have Leibniz, who thinks there are many minds, many different minds. Everything is mind, starting with matter, very primitive mind, all the way to God. Then you have Locke, who is the empiricist. He believes that the senses tells us what's out there. And then you have Berkeley, who is the idealist, because he believes that there's only ideas in my mind. That's the only thing that exists. The point is the proliferation of philosophies is incredible. You know, coming from 1,000 years of Christian dogma where there was pretty much only one philosophy. It's just incredible. So that's a side effect of the Reformation, of the fact that the church lost power in Northern Europe. Okay, we take a break in a few minutes. So this is just the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. And what is interesting about the Industrial Revolution, first of all, it happens in England. That was not the likely place to happen. For a long time, Southern Europe saw England as the ultimate barbarians, as very uncultured people. Even when under Elizabeth, when they were producing quantities of metal objects, whereas continental Europe was producing quality of metal objects. The difference was you guys, you don't know how to do things. And so it was not an obvious place where things could happen, but I told you that England actually was one of the places where what we call now the middle class had more freedom in economic matters. Also, England, so forget Newton, as I said, technology did not use science at that point, but England was not really the vanguard even of the scientific revolution. There were so many in other countries. Nonetheless, you have machines in different ways, and the key is again the use of iron, and that's why I emphasized it when we were talking about Elizabeth first reign. By the way, England back then was importing iron from Sweden. That's weird. Back then, iron was not such a precious thing. Why would you go through the trouble of importing from Sweden? So obviously there must have been a huge market for metal objects, ordinary metal objects. So that thing comes back, because then England has these things where you have machinery made of metal, and you have the first all-metal lathe, and you have boring machines. That's an important change in the way things are made. More revolutions. There's so many different dimensions where you can see this thing. So the microscope, as I mentioned before, I think I had this in the previous slide. You start seeing the microscopic world, which you cannot see with your eyes. And the geology also start discussing the fossils. I mean, this guy says, well, those things are actually not things, and they used to be animals. That will have a powerful implication. I mean, according to the Bible, God created all the animals and unleashed them on the earth. You know, there's nowhere said that some of the animals disappeared. But this is the beginning of a story about that eventually becomes the story of evolution. And at this point, you see the first theories on how the Earth Earth was created. That's also a major change in the way people think. It's not that God one day created the Earth. Where did it come from? Who shaped what shaped the landscape of the Earth? And so there were three main reasons, three main theories. One was based on earthquakes. There were big earthquakes that shaped the Earth. One was volcanoes. Volcanic eruptions shaped the Earth. And the other one was the oceans. And some of these guys already implied the time scale of the Bible is not enough. It's not enough. The Earth has to be older. At the same time, music that eventually will become Baroque music, and you will have Vivaldi and Handel, Bach, and you have the arts. So now you can definitely call it Renaissance. This is wildly different from the Middle Ages. It's even wildly different from Rome. Rome didn't have anything like this. The puzzling thing, and poetry, and from every country, and it's just amazing. Some of the greatest are at this time, from every country. The puzzling thing is that this was a time of endemic warfare. Europe was split into so many states fighting each other all the time. And the Renaissance actually came out of Italy, which was probably the most, at that point, the most disorganized and occupied country in Europe. There were people from all over invading Italy. First the Arabs, the Normans, the Spanish, the French, eventually the Austrians, and still the Renaissance come out of Florence and Rome. And all over Europe you have this incredible resurrection. That's what really Renaissance means. Resurrection of thought, of art, of music, of engineering, of science. So that's what makes history interesting. Let's take a break.